What if I told you the wealth story we celebrate today didn't begin with ambition, expansion, or the pursuit of dominance, but with something far less dramatic: restraint? You were taught that nations rise by accumulating power. Norway rose by refusing to use it. And that's the paradox we need to sit with. A country of barely 5.3 million people becomes the quiet steward of a sovereign wealth fund now exceeding 20 trillion kroner, holding stakes in thousands of companies across the globe. That kind of scale shouldn't be possible for a nation that small, yet it happened. And it didn't happen the way you think. You might assume that oil alone explains it: a windfall, a resource, a stroke of geological luck. But when you look closer, the data tells a different story: a story of caution, boundaries, and an almost countercultural insistence on saying no when the rest of the world would have said yes. Norway posted a fiscal surplus of over 13% of GDP in 2024 while maintaining one of the highest tax to GDP ratios in the developed world. Think about that: high taxes, high spending, and still an overflowing surplus. It contradicts almost everything traditional economic narratives tell you. That's the mechanism. Because when most nations discover wealth, they accelerate, they expand budgets, inflate expectations, and treat prosperity as something permanent. Norway did the opposite. It slowed down. It separated the wealth it earned from the wealth it allowed itself to use. And every time it resisted the urge to spend more, that resistance made the system stronger. You might think this sounds impossible. It isn't. The more Norway limited access to its oil revenue, the more powerful the underlying structure became. That's the illusion. The effect of this restraint is visible everywhere: an employment rate near 75%, one of the lowest NEET levels in the OECD, a labor market that remains stable even as other advanced economies cycle through shocks. It's tempting to attribute that stability to natural resources, but natural resources have never guaranteed stability. If anything, the historical pattern shows the opposite. The difference here wasn't what Norway found underground, but the political culture it built above it, a culture shaped not by wealth, but by fear of what wealth can do when it goes unchecked. And here's the part that should make you pause: wealth didn't create their governance model. The governance model created their wealth. The boundaries came first: the social trust, the institutional discipline, the willingness to say that even abundance must be rationed. Most nations only learn that lesson after a crisis. Norway learned it before one arrived. Why did this small, remote country succeed where so many others failed? Why did restraint become a multiplier instead of a limitation? Those questions matter because they expose a deeper truth. Prosperity isn't just about resources, it's about the framework that controls them. It's about the rules a society sets to protect itself from its own impulses. And if you look closely, you'll see the quiet principle running through all of it: that wealth is not created by extraction, but by governance. And governance only works when people trust it enough to accept limits. This is the part you're not imagining. Norway's miracle wasn't built by oil, it was built by boundaries. And once you understand that, the entire story changes, because the real foundation of this system wasn't discovered in 1969. It was already there, shaped by a political culture designed to prevent the very dangers prosperity brings. Because once trust breaks, nothing else holds. What if I told you that Norway's rise didn't begin with oil or wealth or strategy, but with something far more ordinary: a culture that refused to see prosperity as an individual prize? Everyone imagines the story starts in 1969 when the offshore fields were discovered. It doesn't. The real foundation was laid decades earlier in a country that had almost nothing and yet behaved as if shared responsibility was its only reliable asset. You might think that sounds romantic. It isn't, it's structural. Before the first barrel was ever pumped, Norway was a fishing, timber, and shipping economy. Small industries, modest wages, rural communities scattered across the mountains and coastlines. But beneath that simplicity was a political culture shaped by cooperative, strong unions and an egalitarian mindset that insisted every person mattered to the whole. This mattered more than anyone realized, because when a society grows up expecting to solve problems together, the temptation to fight over resources weakens, and that expectation quietly defined everything that came next. The political system mirrored this mindset. A multi party parliament, coalitions shifting as issues changed, and a tradition of compromise that treated governance as a shared responsibility rather than a battleground. Norway's democracy wasn't built for spectacle, it was built for function. High trust levels reflect that nearly half the population reports confidence in national institutions, significantly above the OECD average, and voter turnout consistently approaches 78%, a level that reveals something deeper. People participate because they believe their voice still matters. That's the structure. The effect of this democratic culture was simple but profound. It made public resources something to be protected, not exploited. When a country sees its institutions as extensions of the community, corruption has fewer places to hide. Local governance reinforced that sentiment. With 357 municipalities, many with fewer than 5,000 residents, political authority remained close to the people. Decisions felt local, even when guided by national standards. And when citizens feel ownership, compliance becomes voluntary rather than forced. You're not imagining it. This is happening. From those foundations grew a social model designed around human capital rather than financial capital. Universal health care, free university education, welfare provision untethered from employment. These choices weren't ideological, they were practical. A small nation needed as many skilled, healthy, and secure citizens as possible. By ensuring that education completion rates reached 82% above most advanced economies, and by maintaining a work culture where only 1% regularly worked excessively long hours, Norway invested in long term productivity rather than short term output. Here's the mechanism. The effect of this investment was stability, a healthier population, a more mobile workforce, a society where people could take risks because basic needs weren't weaponized against them. And the consequence was a labor market structure that remained flexible, adaptive, and cohesive. You might ask, how does this explain inequality? The answer sits inside the tripartite negotiation system, the coordinated bargaining structure involving the state, labor unions, and employer associations. This didn't just manage wages, it compressed them, it reduced disparities, it stabilized expectations. That's the illusion. Because most people assume wage equality is the product of generous redistribution. In Norway, it was built through negotiation, not after the fact correction. The result was one of the lowest poverty rates in the advanced world, and a wage distribution so compressed that even high income earners remained tethered to the collective outcome. This reduced the political pressure that often fractures societies when inequality rises. It also protected the economy from the destabilizing effects of polarized earnings and the gender labor income gap, driven more by hours worked than wage differences, reinforced how normalized equity became in everyday life. But here's the problem: systems built on restraint are only visible when pressure hits them. And Norway's restraint didn't begin with oil, it began with scarcity. A small economy learns early that windfalls don't come often, and when they do, they can distort everything. So when the offshore fields were discovered, Norway already had a cultural immune system in place, a skepticism towards sudden wealth, a fear of easy gains, a belief that windfalls shouldn't reshape the social contract. Scarcity taught discipline. Plenty would demand even more of it. The consequence of all this is straightforward. When the oil arrived, Norway didn't need to reinvent its institutions. It only needed to extend the logic that already held them together: trust, restraint, and collective responsibility. Everything changed in 1969, and yet the one thing that mattered never changed at all. Because once trust breaks, nothing else holds. What if I told you that the biggest mistake most resource rich nations make isn't discovering wealth, it's believing that wealth will behave? Everyone assumes oil creates prosperity. It doesn't. Oil creates pressure. And the way a country responds to that pressure determines everything that follows. You might think that sounds exaggerated. It isn't. Because when you study the nations that struck resource riches before Norway ever did, you start to see the same pattern repeating with almost mathematical consistency. The moment a country discovers a valuable resource, its currency strengthens, export revenues accelerate, domestic prices climb, industries that once defined national productivity fade as oil becomes the dominant source of income. Governments expand programs because it suddenly feels safe to spend more, and political factions begin competing for control over the new revenue. That's the mechanism. In the worst cases, this cycle produces dependence, corruption, and long term instability. It hollowed out manufacturing bases, destabilized budgets, and concentrated power in ways that left institutions weaker, not stronger. Why would stability produce collapse? Norway watched this unfold elsewhere. It studied what went wrong. And instead of repeating those choices, it engineered a system that refused to behave like a petrostate. The key moment came in 1990 when the country created the Government Pension Fund Global, a sovereign firewall built not to grow wealth quickly, but to protect society from wealth itself. The design was almost defiant in its simplicity. All oil revenues would be invested abroad. Only the estimated real return, roughly 3%, could be spent domestically. The principle would remain untouched. A country that refused to feast on its own wealth. The effect was immediate. It forced every government, regardless of ideology, to operate within boundaries anchored to long term sustainability rather than short term popularity. No election cycle could override the rule. No political pressure could unlock the principle. And because the money flowed into global financial markets instead of domestic projects, Norway avoided the overheated cycles that affected so many other resource rich economies. The consequence was stability. Surpluses moved into the fund during strong years, deficits drew from it during weak years, automatic stabilization without political drama. You're not imagining it. This is happening. The macroeconomic logic deepened the protection. Oil revenue entered the economy slowly, predictably, and only through the national budget. By allowing the government to fund roughly one-fifth of its annual expenditures through the fund's return, Norway avoided the inflationary surges that typically accompany resource booms. It also shielded wages from rapidly rising energy driven incomes that could have destabilized labor markets. Here's the problem: most nations spend first and plan later. Norway planned first and then constrained itself to that plan. The result was an economy that kept its productive sectors alive even as its financial assets grew. Manufacturing didn't evaporate. Services didn't become overpriced, and inflation never spiraled because policymakers could not, by design, inject unlimited oil revenue into domestic circulation. That's the structure. But this doesn't mean Norway avoided strain. The labor market tells a more complex story. Employment rates remain high. Roughly three-quarters of working age adults participate, yet beneath that stability are fractures that reveal the system's human limits. Participation among young and prime age men has declined. Long term sick leave usage has risen. Disability support claims remain elevated. Immigrant employment gaps persist, showing the difficulty of integrating workers in a high skill, high wage economy, and technological change continues to polarize skills, leaving lower educated workers more vulnerable. Even strong foundations carry fractures. The effect of these structural pressures is subtle but important. A country can design perfect fiscal rules, but labor markets depend on people, their health, their skills, their ability to adapt. And when dropout rates stay high or skill mismatches widen, the model absorbs strain quietly. It doesn't collapse, but it begins to feel the weight of its own expectations. You might ask, how does a country stay rich by limiting the very thing that made it rich? Because restraint protected the system from overheating, and protecting the system preserved the wealth. Norway's paradox is that it grew powerful not by extracting more, but by deliberately extracting less. The rules mattered more than the resource. The boundaries mattered more than the abundance, and the discipline mattered more than the discovery. Do you still think this ends with a simple success story? Because the true revelation was never about oil at all. It was about the system that governed it. What if I told you the most valuable resource in Norway never came out of the ground? You were told the country's strength was built on oil, that a geological accident delivered a permanent advantage. But the real foundation was something quieter, harder to measure, and far easier to overlook: trust. The kind of institutional trust that lets a society design limits for itself and then actually follow them. You might think that sounds idealistic. It isn't. It's the core of the system. Because when you peel back the surface, you start to see a truth most nations never confront. Wealth isn't just created through extraction, it's created through the architecture that controls extraction, the rules that govern how revenue enters the economy, how it's distributed, and how much of it a society is willing to delay for the future. Most countries see oil as income. Norway saw it as risk. That's the illusion. Here's the mechanism. The country built a governance framework where transparency wasn't a slogan but a structural guardrail. Institutions had to publish decisions. Public records remained open. Accountability was embedded through laws that treated information as a shared asset rather than a political weapon. And because corruption historically weakens when decision making becomes visible, Norway built a system where trust didn't just exist, it accumulated. The effect was profound. When you trust your institutions, long term policies stop feeling like sacrifices and start feeling like investments. This is the part that should make you pause. From that foundation came the rule that defines the entire model. No more than 3% of the sovereign wealth fund's value can be used each year, not the oil revenue itself, the return on the investments made with that revenue. This is where the logic becomes unmistakable. By restricting spending to the estimated long term return, the system insulated public services from resource volatility. It also prevented political cycles from influencing how much money entered the economy. And because the rule applies to every government, regardless of ideology or circumstance, it neutralizes short term populism before it starts. Prosperity is a design choice. The effect of that design was counterintuitive. Norway had to maintain high taxes even as its wealth surged, a tax to GDP ratio above 40%, government expenditure close to half the economy, citizens paying heavily in a country that could have paid everything for them. But here's the problem: real wealth isn't about how much a government can spend today, it's about how much stability it can preserve tomorrow. And when a nation chooses preservation over indulgence, the burden shifts from revenue to responsibility. Why would a rich society willingly keep its taxes high? Because the entire system only works if every generation contributes to the next. The consequence is visible on the global stage. Norway is not an empire, it's not the center of global finance. It doesn't project power through military force or diplomatic dominance. Instead, it became a shareholder in more than 9,000 companies across 70 countries, quietly owning around 1.5% of all publicly listed equities worldwide. By distributing its wealth outward, the country effectively outsourced growth to the entire global economy. This wasn't ambition, it was risk mitigation, and the result was a form of influence that didn't require control, it required patience. Supporting all of this is the invisible architecture that rarely makes headlines: low corruption, transparent budgeting, digital governance with one of the highest scores in advanced economies, institutions that treat restraint not as a limitation, but as a stabilizing force. And because every part of the structure reinforces the others, shocks that destabilize other nations pass through Norway with less turbulence. It's not immunity, it's resilience. You might think this sounds impossible, a system sustained by trust, limits, and long term planning. Yet the evidence is right there: a sovereign fund built slowly, protected fiercely, and used sparingly, a fiscal rule that prevents political excess, a tax system that stays high even when the country could afford to lower it, and institutions designed not to maximize power but to minimize fragility. That's the structure. But here's the consequence, the part many overlook. Systems aren't judged by their design, they're judged by how they shape everyday lives. And a structure built on discipline must eventually confront the tension between what people expect and what the system allows. Do you still think this ends without pressure? Because once trust breaks, nothing else holds. What if I told you that even the most successful economic model carries a human cost? A cost that doesn't show up in budget surpluses or sovereign fund returns, but in the quiet pressures people absorb every day. You were told Norway is the closest thing we have to a perfectly functioning society: high trust, low inequality, clean air, strong social bonds, universal services that cushion almost every major life risk. And on the surface, it's true. Life satisfaction hovers above 7 out of 10. Most people feel secure, supported, and connected. The society feels predictable, stable, safe. Yet stability has a cost, because when you look closer, the numbers begin to tell a different story, a story of strain hidden inside strength. Disability rates remain among the highest in advanced economies. Long-term sick leave usage sits persistently above comparable countries. Immigrant workers face significant employment gaps, especially those with lower education levels. Youth dropout rates stay alarmingly high for a country that invests so heavily in education. And rural-urban divides quietly widen as opportunities concentrate in major cities. The wealth does not solve these, it reveals them. Here's the mechanism: a system built on high wages and high skills creates extraordinary security for those who fit the model, but leaves little room for those who struggle to keep pace. Immigrants with different educational backgrounds face barriers the system was never designed to absorb. Foreign born employment rates lag far behind native born workers, especially in sectors requiring advanced training. Skill mismatches grow, and unemployment among low educated immigrants climbs, not because the society rejects them, but because the structure cannot easily bend. You might think this sounds harsh. It isn't. It's the inevitable tension inside a high skill economy. The effect of this mismatch is simple. As the labor market polarizes, workers with fewer qualifications become increasingly concentrated in low wage sectors, sectors that Norway has intentionally minimized through decades of wage compression. That compression protects equality, but it also removes the entry level jobs that help newcomers integrate. So the country finds itself in a paradox. The very tools that reduced inequality also reduced flexibility. And when flexibility falls, inclusion becomes harder. That's the structure. You're not imagining it. This is happening. Then comes the demographic pressure. Government ministers warn that Norway may run out of people before it runs out of money. It sounds dramatic, but the underlying arithmetic is straightforward. An aging population requires more health care, more long term support, and more workers to sustain the welfare state. Yet participation among younger and prime age men has declined. Disability enrollment has risen in younger cohorts, and the number of people needed to support every retiree will steadily shrink. Here's the problem: the system depends on workforce participation to finance its promises. When participation slows, sustainability becomes a question of labor, not money. The consequence is already shaping policy debates. Raising the retirement age appears unavoidable. Encouraging older workers to delay exit becomes a structural necessity. Lifelong learning shifts from a slogan to a requirement, especially as technology changes the skill demands of every major industry. Immigration becomes more important, but also more difficult, because integrating workers into a high wage, high skill society takes time. And youth education must adapt quickly, or the dropout rates will create long term vulnerabilities. Why would a wealthy society face this much pressure? Because complexity grows with prosperity. This is the part that should worry you. Prosperity doesn't remove human limitations, it magnifies them. When a nation builds a system designed to deliver universal stability, every crack in that system becomes a shared burden. High taxes require high compliance. High public services require deep trust. Coordinated decision making requires collective patience. And a model that delivers security through restraint demands that people accept slower change, tighter rules, and fewer shortcuts. It is prosperity built on discipline, not indulgence. The human dimension becomes clearer the longer you study it. A Norwegian citizen participates in a social contract that asks more of them than meets the eye. It asks them to trust institutions even when decisions are unpopular. It asks them to embrace high taxation as the price of stability. It asks them to support policies that move gradually rather than react quickly. And it asks them to see their own prosperity as part of a shared balance, one that must remain stable across generations, not just across election cycles. Do you still think this ends without tension? Because as the world changes, even Norway's model faces forces beyond its control. What if I told you that one of the most influential financial powers on earth isn't a superpower, a global capital, or a vast empire, but a small nation of just over 5 million people? Everyone assumes global influence requires population, territory, or military strength. Norway proves otherwise. It became a silent shareholder in nearly every major corporation on the planet, not through conquest, but through accumulation. And the scale of that accumulation reshapes how we think about power in the modern economy. The paradox is simple. A country smaller than many global cities now owns around 1.5% of the world's publicly listed equities. That includes stakes in thousands of companies across every major industry and region. It is a quiet presence, rarely discussed, rarely noticed, yet always there, participating in the gains and losses of the global system. You might think this sounds impossible. It isn't, because the mechanism is clear once you trace the fund's design. By diversifying outward rather than inward, Norway allowed the world economy to grow its wealth for it. That's the illusion. Here's the mechanism. Norway's global position emerged not from ambition, but from neutrality, a strategic neutrality that avoided geopolitical entanglements and focused on stability instead of influence. By remaining outside major political blocs while cooperating closely with European markets, the country maximized exposure to global growth while minimizing exposure to conflict. The effect was a more predictable investment environment, and the consequence was a sovereign wealth fund that could allocate capital based on long term market fundamentals rather than short term political pressures. You're not imagining it, this is happening. But neutrality wasn't the only factor. Norway embraced a dual identity that many countries would struggle to balance. On one hand, it is a champion of renewable investment, directing billions toward wind, solar, and sustainable technologies. On the other, it remains a major oil producer, extracting fossil fuels while investing profits in the transition away from them. The contradiction creates tension, but also insight, because in a world shifting from production to capital ownership, influence no longer requires aligning moral positions with economic ones. It requires managing both. Here's the problem: when a nation benefits from two opposing forces, it must move slowly, and that slowness is intentional. This duality shapes Norway's global voice: pragmatic, cautious, unrushed. A system that refuses to react quickly because reacting quickly introduces risk. And risk is the one thing the model is designed to minimize. Most nations pursue growth through speed, expansion, or political leverage. Norway pursued it through preservation, through ensuring that every structural choice aligns with long term stability, even when that stability requires embracing contradictions. The consequence is a new form of power, influence through ownership, not domination. When a fund of this scale holds shares in thousands of companies, it cannot act aggressively, it cannot take political stances, it cannot behave like an activist investor. Its power is structural, not confrontational. It shapes corporate behavior not through orders, but through presence. And because it exists within the regulatory frameworks of dozens of countries, it operates as a stabilizing force rather than a disruptive one. That's the structure. You might ask a simple question: how does a country this small maintain such a vast global footprint without becoming politically overextended? The answer is cooperation. Through agreements like the European Economic Area and the Schengen system, Norway enjoys access to markets far larger than itself. This access expands its investment horizon, it reduces costs, and it embeds the country inside a broader legal and regulatory environment that protects both capital and policy autonomy. The effect is subtle but transformative. It allows a small state to participate in global markets as if it were much larger without carrying the burdens of large state politics. And this participation carries lessons for a fractured world. When most nations chase economic transformation through growth at all cost strategies, Norway demonstrates the opposite: that preservation can be a growth strategy, that slow policy cycles can outperform rapid ones, that state and market can constrain each other without collapsing into conflict, and that building a system capable of resisting temptation may be the most effective strategy in an era defined by volatility. Do you still think global influence requires size? Because this leads to the final question. What happens when a model built for restraint meets a century defined by disruption? Because once trust breaks, nothing else holds. What if I told you that Norway's greatest achievement wasn't wealth, but the discipline to act as if it never had any? Everyone assumes prosperity comes from abundance. Norway shows it comes from restraint, the rare willingness to build systems that protect a society not from scarcity but from itself. You might think that sounds exaggerated. It isn't, because the deeper you look, the clearer the paradox becomes. The country became wealthy precisely because it behaved as though it did not deserve to be. It treated every krone of oil revenue as temporary, uncertain, and potentially dangerous. And that mindset shaped a model that refused the easy path, the path of rapid spending, political reward, and short term comfort. Instead, it built walls around its own impulses. It created rules stronger than any election cycle. And it anchored prosperity in a culture that understood how quickly good fortune can distort judgment. Here's the mechanism. When wealth appears suddenly, societies tend to accelerate. Spending rises, expectations rise, politics shifts toward promises that cannot be sustained. Norway inverted the pattern. It slowed down. It taxed heavily even as revenue surged. It insisted that the fund was not a source of gifts, but a store of responsibility. The effect was subtle but transformative. Instead of wealth driving policy, policy constrained wealth, and the consequence was a prosperity that remained stable because it remained disciplined. That's the structure. But even systems built on restraint face limits. Norway's model must now confront demographic pressures that will strain its workforce, challenge its welfare commitments, and reshape its labor markets. It must navigate a world where geopolitical fragmentation may weaken the very global stability that made international diversification so effective, and it must balance climate ambition with the economic reality of being a major oil producer. This is the part that should worry you. Not because collapse is imminent, but because even strong systems feel the weight of change. So the question becomes unavoidable. Can any society maintain restraint once it becomes rich? History suggests how difficult this is. Expectations grow as prosperity grows, patience weakens, trust becomes harder to sustain, and the rules that once protected stability begin to feel restrictive rather than protective. You're not imagining it. This is the cycle most nations follow. But Norway's model was built to resist that cycle by renewing trust constantly, not assuming it. That renewal is not automatic. It cannot be inherited. It must be practiced. The moral is clear. Real power does not come from abundance. It comes from the ability to limit the consequences of abundance. It comes from systems that do not confuse wealth with wisdom or success with permanence. And it comes from societies that recognize prosperity as a responsibility, not a reward, because the moment a system begins to treat wealth as inevitable, it stops protecting itself from loss. And that brings us to the quiet warning beneath Norway's story. Even a nation defined by restraint is not immune to fatigue, political, social, or generational. Even a system built on trust must defend that trust every day. And even governance models designed for longevity are tested when the world changes faster than they can adapt. Which leads to the final truth. Wealth built on discipline requires even more discipline to preserve, because once trust breaks, nothing else holds.